Around May of 2017, I got into a heated debate with an acquaintance of mine over the existence of God. I haven't been in contact with him for quite some time, so for his privacy's sake, I'll be keeping him nameless. In our debate, he was coming from an atheistic point of view, whereas I was coming from a Christian point of view. I was only 14 at the time, with practically zero knowledge on theology or apologetics to even participate in this debate. Yet, I still went head-on with him. During our debate, he asked me this question. You say you believe in a God that created everything from nothing. How could he then exist if he were not also created? He asked me many more questions, like, how can you rely on some old book that may have been fabricated? How can you believe in a God that does nothing to stop the atrocities that we see in the world? How can you believe the Bible when science has disproven its claims? How can you trust that what you believe is true? I had no response. No answers. I don't remember how we ended it off, but I just remember feeling inferior. I started to feel this way because I began to question the existence of God. I felt inferior because I had no answers for why I put my trust in a belief system that I didn't even fully understand. I started to feel inferior because at that point in my life, I had never fully read any of the 66 books of the Bible. I was simply basing my faith on a few stories I was taught in Sunday school, like David and Goliath or Noah's Ark. But those are just mere fractions of the greater story. I began to ask myself similar questions. Why would God allow for people to suffer and die in the world? Why are people constantly getting sick with what feels like a new disease every 5 years? Does God actually exist? This is the first thing that an atheist taught me. He taught me that it was time to start thinking critically and to start doing my research. Up until that debate, I never bothered to ask myself, why am I believing this whole God thing? I realized after our debates that I'd never bothered to think about my faith critically. I'd been practically raised in the Christian church, and I'd become compliant with the belief in God without ever questioning or having a reason as to why I personally believe. I was believing for no reason, really. I then learned that I needed to find a reason. I needed to find the reason as to how this faith has stood the test of time and to this day remains the top in the world. I read the Bible, of course, but I also read a few scientific and historical journals and books. Josh McDowell's book entitled The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and an article from Time magazine entitled Why Science Does Not Disprove God were two of several pieces of data that I used. I'll be outlining the others as I progress. Through these books and journals, I found both historical and scientific evidence that helped me affirm my faith. A man by the name of Dr. Carl Warner, who graduated from the University of Missouri with a distinction in biology, conducted a study whereby he wanted to weigh the evidence between Darwinian evolution or the creationist theory, the theory that God or gods had created all things. The experiment was simple, really. With his fascination in living fossils, he used the fossils of animals, dinosaurs, plants, and so on to see whether or not there were any evolutionary transitions between them, or if there were none at all. He went into the study without any foreknowledge of the organisms in the rock layers that he examined. What he found was that the plants and animals that we know and see today can be found within the same rock layers as prehistoric dinosaurs. His discoveries are further outlined in his two books, Evolution, The Grand Experiment, Volumes 1 and 2. Alongside the dinosaurs, Carl Warner found crustaceans, sharks, snakes, and lizards. He also found birds such as sparrows, owls, penguins, and ducks. 432 different mammal species and examples of every major plant division were recognized in these layers. He of course didn't find every animal and plant species in the world. One would need to traverse the entire earth to do so. But what Carl Warner found within these rock layers was that there was no evidence of any evolutionary transitions between animals or plants. Also, in these rock layers, he discovered that the dinosaurs and animals had died from some great watery catastrophe. In fact, many museums have universally agreed that this catastrophe had to been some kind of great flood in order to explain the fact that land dinosaurs were found with starfish and many other modern-day animals from the sea. As I continued in my research, the question of how can I rely on the Bible when it could have been fabricated kept nagging at my brain. To go about the answer to this question, we first need to understand the nature of the Bible's history. The Bible that we have is split into two acts, if you will. The first act is called the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, and the second act is called the New Testament. These two acts were written on a thing called papyrus. Papyrus is not exactly like modern-day paper, and it's also far less durable. Things like laminating didn't exist at the time, and even if you were to keep papyrus in perfect environmental conditions, it would inevitably deteriorate. And when looking at the formation of the early church, the New Testament and Old Testament papyrus scrolls were being transported all over the place, from ancient Israel all the way to Greece. People were busy grabbing and clutching onto these scrolls, which would have caused further deterioration. So you're now asking yourself, what in the world is the Bible that we have today, based on the fact that the original papyrus manuscripts are long gone? Thankfully, through archaeological excavations, we have been able to find manuscripts from the early century AD. These manuscripts are copies that were made from the original papyrus scrolls of the Old and New Testaments during the rise of Christianity in ancient Israel, Rome, and Greece. Now, the practice of copying wasn't only done for the Bible. Because the printing press would only be invented in 1440, selected individuals, simply referred to as copyists, made it their life's work to transfer the exact words from one piece of text to a new page. Other literary works that went through this process are available today, including the works of Julius Caesar, Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey, and even the writings of Aristotle and Sophocles. There are roughly only 10 manuscripts from Caesar, 49 manuscripts from Aristotle, 193 from Sophocles, and then there are around 649 copies of the works of Homer. The New Testament scriptures alone have over 5,000 plus copies of fragments or complete manuscripts in Greek, which was the spoken language of the times when the first Christian apostles like Peter, John, Paul, Simon, and many others were establishing the early church. Why is this important? Well, first of all, these 5,000 manuscripts don't date to 5,000 years after the events described in the Bible. In fact, the earliest of these manuscripts date just 30 years within the life of the Apostle John. These manuscripts were even written by John himself. And as you can see in this graph, the biblical manuscripts far exceed the chronology of the other writers. So now you're asking yourself, how can you be so sure that these manuscripts are accurate? Since there are so many copies, how do you know that they are accurate to the original? Would there not be errors or discrepancies? Well, yes, of course, there are errors and discrepancies. So then how do we know which of these 5,000 are real and which are not? There is a YouTube channel called the 10-Minute Bible Hour. The host of the channel, named Matt Whitman, who has a degree in history and a master's in theology, conducted an experiment where he asked members of his church to perform this copying process. He printed 50 copies of the poem Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening by Robert Frost. He then gave those copies to children ranging from the ages of 5 to 18 years old. He asked them to copy the poem onto separate pieces of paper as accurately as they could. Out of the 50 copies, he found 43 usable manuscripts from the children. Some of them were complete and accurate, some were complete but had minor errors, some had fragments from the poem that were accurate but were incomplete, and then 7 copies of the poem he took out from the 50 because they were just completely wrong. He then gave the 53 copies to a friend of his who had never heard of the poem or Robert Frost. He asked her if she could take all 43 copies and make one final complete poem. After a few hours, she gave Matt her completed poem, and it was an exact replica of the original poem by Robert Frost. No errors, no spelling mistakes. Every full stop or comma was precisely how Robert Frost had written his poem. This is precisely the same process that went into the Bible. Imagine, this guy just used 50 copies of a poem and asked children to copy it. Now imagine 5,000 copies, all going through the exact same copying process, but not with children, but with trained individuals who made it their life's work to perform this task. Here's something else I learned. From the Time magazine, article, Why Science Does Not Disprove God. It brings into question, how could the universe have been formed? What we know is that 13.7 billion years ago, there was a huge burst of energy whose nature is completely unknown. Then, as if by magic, the Higgs boson, also known as the God particle, just decided to form the universe's mass. It was built upon quarks and electrons. Somehow, the quarks just realized that they needed to bunch together to form protons and neutrons. Their electrical charges were set at the exact level needed to attract and capture the electrons, finally forming the atom. The masses and charges and forces